If you're a founder and you're like, I'm going to be miserable now so that I'm happy in the future, you're lying to yourself. The only way to be happy in the future is to be happy now. This idea of like, I'm living a deferred life so that later on I can be happy, it never plays out that way.
Today, we're talking to Mike Evans, the original founder of GrubHub and more recently, Fixer.com. Mike's going to walk us through the journey of finding GrubHub, some of the obstacles that he ran into along the way, and he's also going to talk about his book, Hangry, which he released in late 2022. This episode is going to feature some awesome advice for founders with help fundraising, finding investors, working with the right investors, and ultimately how entrepreneurs can start and scale their businesses. Don't forget to subscribe to our platform, Techstars, where you can find more helpful advice, entrepreneurial tips, and learn about the founder journey. Thanks, and enjoy this episode. Why don't you tell me about when you knew you wanted to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think somewhere around like 8 years old, 9 years old, my very first entrepreneurial venture. Do you know those like candy bars you can get from the grocery store, the little miniatures? I bought a bag of those at the grocery store and I sold them individually on the bus for people's lunch money.
Wow.
Until I was the subject of what I still think was unfair regulation when I was told that I can't sell candy for people's lunch money because none of the kids could buy lunch. But that was probably my first adventure into it. And then in high school or middle school, I bought a lawnmower and mowed lawns in my neighborhood. And so there was something about this idea of working for myself, trying to figure out how to really how to create a business for myself that goes back pretty far. And so when I ended up having a job right after college for a couple of years, I felt like that was super instructive because I learned how corporations work from the inside a little bit. But the whole time I was there, I sort of had a foot out the door looking for the next thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned this in your book, Hangry, that came out in November of 2022. But bring me back to those early days, early 2000s. You're working this job and you sort of get a little bit fed up with it, it seems. Tell me about the early days of GrubHub, how it got started, and what really prompted you to give it that go.
So, and this was back in like 2000. So it was right after the dot-com bust. And I was a software developer and I had all of the arrogance of like a hotshot software developer. By the way, I haven't lost that, which can be problematic. But I kind of thought I knew everything. And among the things that I thought I knew in that, was I didn't want to just be a software developer. I wanted to like tinker with marketing. I wanted to tinker with sales. I wanted to understand the whole business. I didn't want to be pigeonholed. And the frustrating thing for me is it turns out years later is that I was right about some of the things that I had a problem with, that like HR shouldn't be an organization that protects a company, but should advocate for employees. And, the type of work that people do, they should have a lot of empowerment to sort of make their own decisions about how to bring value for customers. And those things don't fit in a big organization, a big corporation. And that friction, I always wanted to start a business, but also, so there was like a pull to go start something. There's also a push, which was this friction around sort of the typical way that corporations work. And I had a problem with it. Ironically, I ended up running a company where I had 4,500 employees, and it was very much a corporation, by the time we went through the IPO. But there was a big transition. There was a big step between here and there, which was founding GrubHub. And it was this combination of trying to find something else to do with sort of being aware that I was looking for an idea, and I sort of stumbled upon this idea that restaurants had a really hard time getting customers. And everything was physical. There was no digital. And in 2000, that might seem like a really long time ago, but from my perspective at the time, the internet had already been around for 10 years. Why is this taking so long? And so that was really what started like sort of thinking about it. At the time, I wasn't super motivated. I was writing a lot of software at night, but I was also playing a lot of Xbox. I was really good at Halo, so I played that a lot. Eventually what ended up happening is my website, GrubHub, which was a delivery guide, started getting some traction in terms of traffic from Google and MSN and stuff like that. And once I realized that I could sell restaurants, once my business partner, Matt, sold the first restaurant, it was very quick from this sort of thing I was dabbling in to I was full time with it. It was very rapid from one to the next. Once I realized I could make revenue, I could have customers, make money.
I really like the point that you make in the book about how it's a hobby when you're making no money. And then the second that you make that first dollar, it's a business all of a sudden. And so can you talk about the pressure that you felt once you sort of moved away from working in a corporation, working a full-time job to the stress of starting your own company?
Yeah, I think so. I bootstrapped the business, and I think that's a lot more typical than most people realize. Most people have some sort of nest egg they put away, and they're burning that savings as they're trying to start their company, and that's a pretty typical experience. The experience of like you have this friends and family money, or like you get a VC check based on a PowerPoint slide or a Google, or at this point it's probably a Google Slides presentation. It's not common. It's kind of a false narrative. Most people are hustling from this like nest egg they put away. And it's terrifying because once it's gone, you have to tail between your legs, go back to the corporate world. And so there's this combination of like reducing your expenses personally, like eating ramen noodles and being stressed out about the fact that you have no money and your student loans are due and you have to make money. And this model of like, you have to generate revenue as the first thing, fast forward to 2017 when I founded Fixer, which is a handy person. It's like a home care membership company where we employ the handy people ourselves. If you fast forward to that point, the very first hour, the very first day, I had a friend who could fix anything. Her name is Katie, and she had agreed to work for this new company, Fixer. And I had 5 friends who couldn't fix anything. And I texted the 5 friends and said, "We're open for business. Like, who's ready?" And so we made revenue in our first hour of work. And like, I took that concept of like, that's the first thing to an extreme with the start of the business. And then fast forward even a few years with Fixer later, like I forgot it. I forgot that demand was the first thing, that getting customers to generate revenue was the first thing. And we spent a lot of time on operations and getting things right, but we're back to demand again. And so that pressure never goes away, right? Whether it was day 1 selling my first restaurants, week 1, trying to get restaurants signed up on Clark Street in Chicago, or it was year 4 figuring out how to get enough critical mass in Phoenix so that market could launch, or if it was year 10 trying to get enough national presence to be able to start to ramp up towards an IPO. Like in all of those cases, that pressure was there to get customers.
So how do you know when it's time to go full throttle with the idea, I guess? Because something that I read a lot is you want to continue working your full job until you have enough of a business plan and enough demand and, almost traction ready to put that aside and, go with a business that is going to make money. You didn't do that. You did it very differently. You took a risk. How do you think that paid off? Why did you make that decision? How did you know that it was time to go all in?
I think taking the training wheels off, being on the trapeze without a net, makes you a better trapeze artist. It makes you a better cyclist. And leaving the safety of one job to go all in on a new company. First of all, let's recognize that's a privilege. You're coming from a privileged position if you can do that. But it is so much more effective. 51% of success is taking that step. Everything else that you do is an optimization exercise. Because when the training wheels are off and you have, like, if I didn't sell, I was literally eating ramen noodles. I had to sell restaurants to eat. And guess what? Because of it, I sold better. And so that pressure, and that it either works or like I either succeed or the whole thing fails. That sort of fail fast mentality is incredibly powerful, incredibly helpful for actually starting something. The safe approach, stay at your job, keep earning, it doesn't work. If it works, you got lucky. Like that's not, I don't think I would not advocate that process to anyone. Now, I recognize that people have different life circumstances. It's not possible for everyone. And even in my situation, early on when I wasn't selling quite enough restaurants to even like pay my bills, I did arbitrage my time and I did do consulting work where I installed, for instance, a local network for a real estate office, and I charged like a go away fee. Like I didn't want to do the work, but I was like, If I charge $100 an hour, I can work for 10 hours and I earn myself 2 more weeks of working on GrubHub to see if I can get to a break even point. So it's I think taking that first step is really important. Being totally dogmatically purist about it is not necessarily the right approach, though.
What is this saying? It's like chaos drives innovation or scarcity drives innovation. It's like you kind of need these things as motivating factors to push you to that next level. So that's pretty awesome. Um, I want to get into a little bit more the moral and ethical dilemmas that you had while running GrubHub. Um, can you tell me a little bit about that? Because, obviously we're 20 years down the line and a lot has happened since then, but bring us through what it was like at the time and when you started realizing that maybe this wasn't going in the direction that you wanted it to.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of understanding my own goals, my own mission, and also a company's mission, and understanding how those two things, even as the CEO, even as the founder, they're not exactly the same thing. They should be related. They might be close, but they're not exactly the same thing. And early on, I decided I wanted to pay off my school debt. I had 260 grand in school debt, and that was my goal, to pay it off. And then I met that goal. I pretty early on in the adventure. I didn't actually meet the goal, but I met. It seemed clear to me that like the company was on a trajectory that eventually that would happen, and so that goal no longer tracked at some point. And so for me, it became about helping independent restaurants thrive. And the rubric that we used whenever we had like a product or a feature that we were going to add was, does this make it more likely for restaurants to be in business a year from now if we release this product? If the answer was no, we didn't do it. But what happened is the company got bigger and we got more and more investors, and we merged with another company that was coming out of Seamless, which was coming out of Aramark. And then we got private equity investors. And then finally we were looking at public investors. The desire for profit at all costs just becomes a much more powerful incentive. And there are plenty of examples of companies that fight this. Patagonia is a great example of this. They have decided that they're making long-term value that's environmentally sustainable, right? And because of it, they've built a great business because they stuck that landing and they build their whole business around it. If you build a business around quarterly profits to the cost of all other stakeholders, you get what you ask for, right? And so as it started to slip towards that direction, it was frustrating because it was no longer just my company anymore, and my ability to sort of course correct the company became much more difficult. And so ultimately, I ended up leaving the company because my goals and my vision. A lot of people are like, "Well, you got burnt out." I was like, "I wasn't burnt out. I had a lot left to give. I was still hungry, but my goals no longer aligned with where the company was heading." And so, you really have two options at that point: change the goals of the organization you're working for, or go do something else. And so, I chose to do something else. After a couple of years, went home with my daughter. I then started this new company, which is a B Corp, and the whole mentality behind the business is our business advantage and our social benefit are the same thing. We train people from scratch to be handy people in an environment where the supply is very constrained, which gives us an economic advantage, and it also helps the communities that we work in. And so you got to be thoughtful about this stuff from the beginning. And I also recognize that if I went back in time and talked to 24-year-old Mike and was like, "You've got to think about the social impact of your business," that guy would have been like, "Okay, boomer, I have school debt. I'll deal with it later," right? And so it's hard. It's not as easy as what I just said, but it is important to start thinking about this stuff early.
Yeah, definitely. That's so interesting. I mean, I'm 24 right now, so it's sort of crazy to think about, just how someone's life can change so much and how the goals that they have for themselves can adapt based on the successes that they're seeing or the failures that they're seeing. What, in your opinion, what would you say is like the ideal goal for a tech startup? How do founders, navigate through those ethical and moral dilemmas?
Well, if you have a choice that you have to make as a founder, you can either decide what success looks like for you, or you can not make that choice. And if you don't make that choice, someone else will decide for you. And who that person will be, or who that group of people will be, if you don't decide for yourself, is completely out of your control. So if you end up with investors that care a lot about turning a quick profit at the cost of all other players, that becomes the goal of the company, right? And so if the ship is rudderless, it just goes where the waves and the wind are pushing. And so I think making that explicit choice as a founder is the only way to guarantee that someone is thinking about this, because everybody will have a goal for your lives. Churches will have a goal for your life. Your parents, your kids, society, government, investors, everyone will have a goal for your life and for your company. And so the only way to make sure that that's something intentional is to choose to be intentional about it. And it is the case, I think, with VCs. Often what that ends up being is venture capitalists are by and large really excited about creating something from nothing, creating value for customers by innovation. And so early on in the journey, that's actually really aligned with what my goals were for the organization, or for myself as well. And it's a really great set of goals. They also want to make money, but it's not the good VCs, it's not their primary thing. Their primary thing is creating value for customers through innovation. And even private equity company like firms, they tend to cluster around this idea of making companies more efficient, right? Cutting away the fat, making sure that there aren't extra departments in the organization that aren't needed, that they're focused, and so that they can turn a profit, right? And so they're providing efficiency. They're providing value and knowledge and expertise on efficiency. The problem really becomes with public markets. The only thing that the public investor cares about is that their stock price is worth more when they sell it than when they bought it. And that drives quarterly earnings at the cost of everything else. And what's nuts is that companies don't exist primarily to make money, which is, it sounds like it sounds like capitalism blasphemy. But actually, even within capitalism, companies exist to create value for customers. And in so doing, they happen to make a profit for themselves. And so understanding this nuance, having an opinion, and if that opinion is like, I have explicitly decided I want to get rich quick at the cost of all others, great, good for you. As long as it was explicit, as long as you decided that, as opposed to as implicit, I think that's great. And I can say that because almost nobody decides that. There are bad actors, but almost nobody is willing to sacrifice any relationship or any community or any stakeholder just to get rich. And so being intentional about how you're going to create value for customers, how you're going to think about stakeholders, how you think your company exists in the community early, actually creates, I think, a higher probability of a profitable company. And so, this is sort of the message of the book is, I thought about this a little too late. I wish I had thought about it sooner.
Yeah, I can see how that might have been difficult to realize, 10 or so years after the fact. And I could tell through the jumping back and forth between the journey as it's happening and then the bike ride as you're sort of reflecting on it. This is something that I felt you maybe started to get inklings of during the process. And then as you brought in more people, continued to take more investments, things started to get a little bit out of control. So I want to stay on this theme of fundraising for a little bit. Can you share some advice about how founders can create a strong cap table and actually, can you share some reasons why they might turn down investor money for whatever reason you think might be justified?
Yeah, I think it's worth recognizing that everybody's cash is just as green, right? Cash from investor A and cash from investor B, if that's the only thing you have to go on, you have no data to make a choice. And so the answer must lie somewhere other than the funds or even the availability of funds. Because if one investor doesn't have enough, there's always another series of investors that you can go to that are larger. And so Chuck Templeton, who founded OpenTable, he was my mentor. He shared these ideas with me. And so I'm just going to regurgitate what he told me. Mm-hmm. The first thing is strategic alignment. You want someone who thinks strategically like you do, right? So thinks about how to structure the business, what the goals of the business are, how fast you should grow, like what's the relationship between growth and dilution, like all of those things are really valuable. You want somebody who's good at something. So investors who are only investors are not good investors to have. They had to have done something with their life other than just investing. Because if they don't have any experience with either marketing or product or sales or recruiting or HR strategy or whatever, they have to be a domain expert at something. Otherwise, if they're just a consultant that sells widgets, they're not good on a board. You do not want those kind of investors. And so you want somebody who has some kind of domain expertise. You want somebody who's got good relationships that they can share with you. And that might mean partnerships, it might mean employees, it might mean relationships with other investors. It sort of depends on what you need based on your business. And then you want someone whose values align with yours, which means you have to have gone through the exercise of understanding what your values are. I mean, everybody can just list 10 positive attributes and say, those are my values. But the real exercise is like, do I care about respect or honesty more? Like, obviously I care about both of them, but like, which one of those is really more important to me? And then finding those investors that share those values. And so once you do all of those things, then money is sort of the last thing on the list. And again, making this choice comes from a place of privilege, because sometimes the investment process feels like you got to kiss 100 frogs, and finally one of them they actually don't turn into a prince. They turn into not a frog. And it's gonna be, you have to have several frogs turn into not frogs before you can realize if you're talking to a prince, right? And so, so the only way to be able to make choices about which investor to choose from is to generate choices, which means a big funnel, talking to a lot of investors, getting to that second stage, getting to the partner meeting, getting to those second stage conversations with multiple parties so that you can choose between them. The other thing that you can do is you can filter which investors you're going to talk to first. So by way of example, so with Fixer, when I raised money for Fixer, the first thing I would do I had a different scenario, because I had people reaching out to me, but I was also reaching out to investors. And I had people reach out to me because of my previous experience. But in all of those cases, I went to their partner page and I looked at their partners, and I simply noted whether or not there was any women or people of color at the partnership level. If the answer was no, I wouldn't have a conversation with them. And so I filtered based on values before I even had the conversation, so that I wouldn't end up in a situation where I had a term sheet from an investor whose values didn't align with mine. And so I recommend that founders do that they do research before having the first conversation, so they don't end up in a bind if they get a term sheet from the wrong investor.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that due diligence is 100% essential for the fundraising process. Can you dive a little bit deeper on the fundraising process with GrubHub? Maybe talk about, I know it might seem interesting, but the failures that you experienced going through the fundraising process, the no's that you took, and then the lessons that you learned from that first fundraising process, the second one, the third one, however many you went through.
The very first lunch I had with an investor, I had no idea what I was doing. There was no Techstars at the time. There was nothing. And I remember showing him the financials, my projected financials, and he was like, "Your balance sheet doesn't balance." And I was like, "Of course it doesn't. You're supposed to have more assets than liabilities." He's like, "I think you should go take an accounting class." And I was like, "Okay, I guess balance sheets are supposed." I didn't even know what that meant at the time. So I was very green. I did not know what I was doing.
Yeah.
And it took 2 years from that first conversation. So I bootstrapped the business. I started those conversations. So I bootstrapped the business for 2 years, started investor conversation, and then 2 more years before we finally closed investment. So it was 4 years of bootstrapping before we closed investment. And it just took a ton to just get anybody to say yes to me. And so that was sort of the early experience, is that it just getting a yes was really tough. And it just took persistence and time and conversations. And my partner worked on it and I worked on it, and we networked. We won the University of Chicago's business plan competition. It still took a year after that, right? So it took a lot to get that first investment. But then something happened after the first investment. Each one after that got easier, because now we were like a known commodity. And so during that second part of the strategy, it actually, even for the first investment, my strategy had been, I don't care about the dilution. I don't care about the valuation. What I care about is, does it increase the probability of an exit? Not of a big exit, but the probability of an exit. Because the incremental value of being able to pay off my student loans and maybe have a nest egg, maybe if I'm lucky, pay off mortgage on a house, the value of those dollars is so much more like the value of $1 million to a person is so much more than the value of $1 billion if you have a higher likelihood of making the $1 million. And so I was optimizing for get an investor that's good, not maximize the terms of the term sheet. And then so we raised 1 million the first round, 2 million for the second round to get into 14. So we got into 4 cities in the first round. We raised 2 million to get to another 14 cities. And then the next round, the C, which at the time were called C and D, that was a combined $31 million. So it was like 1, 2, 31. So it was a huge jump from the first round to the next round. And at that point, we were in, when I raised that third round, we were in 15 cities. We were making, $5 million a year. We were profitable. And so that was a much bigger experience. And that was more about, okay, can we really make this thing national? Can we really take this thing like a rocket ship? And then the next investment was about acquisitions headed towards an IPO.
So I'm glad you mentioned Techstars there, because obviously one of our biggest goals is to get founders access to more capital, get them in front of the investors that are going to be providing the funds for these pre-seed and seed rounds. And obviously, if you get those funds, like you said, it's sort of a cascading effect. They can build on that, use the momentum that they get from the resources that investors have given them and continue to grow. How did you get involved with Techstars?
Yeah, so way back when I started GrubHub, so this was like 2008 or 2009. There was an accelerator / incubator that started in Chicago called Accelerate Labs. Mm-hmm. And eventually they merged into being Techstars. So I went from being a mentor at one of those early accelerators and then to being a mentor at Techstars. And I invested in a couple of the funds there. I love the idea of helping another founder learn from my mistakes or learn from my experiences so that they can increase the chance of their own success. The thing that was really challenging about me just doing that generally, like I just have office hours. I meet with people, and I probably met with like 1,000 entrepreneurs. And I think 3 of them actually started a business that made revenue. Like 997 of them did not. And so all these people wanted to reach out to me and talk to me because they were founding a business. But one of the nice things about Techstars from an investor and mentor perspective is there's a filter. Like you're talking to people who've already been vetted to some degree. So it really sucks to just invest hours in somebody who then doesn't actually start a company. You're like, well, that was a waste of my time. And so I've really liked Techstars because it's a filter on both sides of that network. It's a filter for to get in is actually a little bit challenging. There's a bar that you have to get over. And so the quality of the entrepreneurs that I meet and the entrepreneurs that meet each other is higher. Also, is a bar on investors because there's a lot of like wannabe investors that are like pretending that don't actually invest in companies and will burn a lot of your time to feel important. And like, you don't want to talk to them either. And then there are even bad actors that it's hard to be a bad actor and stay involved in an organization like Techstars. So that filter on both sides of the network is actually really helpful in terms of a higher hit rate between those two groups.
Yeah. So what's like the Mike Evans masterclass of because you're a mentor for the Chicago.
Your job and start. That's it. Oh wait, no, sorry. I'll let you finish the question.
No, I was just saying you're a mentor for the Chicago program. You've been with them for years. That's who introduced us. But what's the masterclass? What's the one that gets all the founders saying, "Oh, Mike Evans, founder of GrubHub, came in and he gave me the best advice I've ever gotten."
Yeah, I can give the quick 2-minute version of that class. It's about hiring. Okay. So the idea behind hiring is you need one person to do a job, right? And how do you get that one person? And the way the wrong answer is talk to your friends. And it's wrong for like 8 different reasons, but the top 2 are: 1, they're not going to be the highest quality people to do the job, and 2, that's a really good way to introduce racial and gender bias into your hiring process if you just talk to your friends. And so what you do instead is you start with a huge funnel. You post the position in as many places as makes sense. So you end up with 1,000 people in the top of your funnel. And then you build filters so that at each step, there's less people who get through the process. And the process needs to run quick. It needs to happen in like 3 days to be able to get somebody from the top of the funnel through the bottom of the funnel. And at the top of the funnel, the first filter, since you have 1,000 people you have to talk to, it has to be automated, right? So the first filter is very simple. I simply ask people, I email them and I simply ask people, and I don't even do this, a system does this for me that says, hey, why are you interested in this position? It filters out 95% of job applicants. So only 5% will actually answer that question, will respond and answer that question. So you find out who's actually engaged in the process right there. And then from there, you might go to a phone call. And then from there, you might go to an in-office position interview where you're actually testing the skill that somebody's doing. If they're sales, you have them sell. If they're technology, you have them write code in front of you. If they're a data analyst, you have them do a regression analysis on some data. And so those three primary filters, an automated one, some sort of phone one that's usually for values alignment, and then a skill one. Those filters, if they're really good, allows you to have a really big funnel, and then they all come down to, you end up with like 3 or 4 candidates. And if you're thoughtful about it, if you make sure that the top of your funnel where you're advertising is gender and race balanced, you end up with representation all the way through your hiring process. So by way of example, with Fixer, if we just hired where construction people usually look for jobs, we'd be getting 95% of our applicants are men. And we're a gender balanced workplace. We're trying to create access to the trade in a gender inclusive way. And so what we do is we don't advertise in construction places. We advertise in the same places where people are applying to Whole Foods or Target or whatever. So so that's like that's the masterclass. It's a huge funnel with really effective automated filters at the top, ends up with 1 or 2 or 3 really good candidates. That same process can be applied to investors, and that same process can be applied to consumers. And so I think thinking in terms of funnels and filters is a really effective way to drive your business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can imagine, I know you mentioned that why do you want this role piece in the book, and I can imagine that filters out so many people because they're just sending out easy applications on LinkedIn, they're just throwing a resume in, they're just putting something out there because they know that they need to. The amount of people that reply back with a genuine response probably is very helpful in, like you said, filtering out those wannabe applicants.
Sometimes you get people who are offended. You ask the question, which, by the way, don't hire them.
What do you mean?
Like it's probably pretty obvious. But if somebody doesn't even want to answer a single question via email, like you're headed towards the, well, that's not my job description argument, which you can't do in a startup. You might be able to do that in a corporation, but in a startup, everybody wears 18 hats.
Is there a right answer to that question, do you think?
It's just no. There's no right answer to the question. The right answer to the question is they answered the question. There's no, I mean, if they come back with like a lot of attitude, or if their answer is not relevant at all, if I ask, why do you want to work here, and their response is blue, like that's like it has to be somehow related to the actual question.
Yeah, cool. So I want to go back to GrubHub for a little bit and just talk about the IPO process. I guess even before that, the merger, the IPO process, and the ultimate decision to quit and then go on this adventure, this trek across the country. Can you just talk me through that a little bit more for the people that haven't read the book? What was going on in those 2 years leading up to that, ultimate breaking point?
Yeah, I think what was happening. So after the merger with Seamless, they were like our enemies for long. They were our competition, and then we merged with them. And the thing that really shocked me was how much I liked the people that I worked with. That these people who had been my enemies for so long were now my colleagues and my friends. And that was an interesting realization that all like your closest competition is solving the same problems you are, and you have a lot in common with them. And so, I say this in the book that the first rule of mergers and acquisitions is don't be an asshole. And this is why, because it's people, and they're people like you who are on the other side of that table. And so just being kind and friendly and open might end up making you millions of dollars. Like don't treat the competition like jerks, treat them like with respect. Right. And so we went through the merger. The process of going through the merger was really, really wonderful. But this was right around the time that the company was starting to toy with the idea of doing deliveries themselves and moving into the gig economy. And there was a combination of that and the amount that the companies had started charging restaurants, which I didn't agree with. I think what I wanted, on when you think about take rate, which is the percentage a company charges its customers, on one extreme end, you have Ticketmaster, which is charges so much they can only get away with it through really nasty tactics, right? Threatening and monopolistic practices. And so that's not the answer. And then you have companies that don't charge enough, and then they don't, like maybe Craigslist is an example of this. And Craigslist is great. And you'll note that Craigslist has a ton of staying power, right? And so the lower you charge, the more staying power you have, the more your customers value you, but the less resources you have to do something with it. And the more you charge, maybe the more profit you make for a short term, but typically doesn't result in staying power. And so I just because it's not good for the restaurants for the long term, I think that we should have charged less going into the IPO. But I didn't have the power to make that change. And so the company was really moving away from benefiting restaurants and going towards benefiting shareholders. And so for me, that was the transition. I was like, I want to create a company that values customers. And because they value customers, shareholders benefit, not the other way around. And there just wasn't appetite within the company for that mentality. And so that's why I went through it. The IPO process itself, everybody should do it. It was a lot of fun. One of the things that came out of it, and I wrote this in the book in Hangry, was everyone involved in the process, except for the founders, has done it several times. And so like, you're the noob, you're the beginner in this situation. And it's really easy to get taken advantage of. And so finding really good counsel is critical for yourself as a founder, as an executive, not for the company. Because everybody else has done this multiple times. And some things that are just accepted as the way things are actually really disadvantageous to to the company, to the founders, to the employees. So that was an eye-opening experience, probably not terribly surprising now that I think about it in retrospect. And then I went on this bike ride, and it was great to decompress. It was stressful having thousands of employees for 10 years and investors and all this stuff. It's just riding my bike across the United States and camping was it was a good way to like create a contrast to the private jet, investment bank IPO process versus riding a bike and staying in a tent eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And I felt like it grounded me again in a way that I'm really glad I did, because it allowed me to then live the life I wanted to like in the last 10 years since then.
Yeah, I loved that juxtaposition of going from literally a private jet across the country for the IPO to, sleeping in a hostel in Virginia Beach or in a tent, in a campground or whatever. That's really cool to just sort of strip yourself from those material things. But I want to hear just, at a deeper level, tell me a little bit more about this constant discontentment or insatiability or like wanderlust, adventurous aspect of your personality, because that's clearly what has shaped you into becoming the entrepreneur and the founder that you are. But it's really, awesome for me to hear what it's like from the person who's gone through all these experiences. How did you use those potentially, flawing characteristics to turn it into a billion-dollar business?
Yeah, it's funny. Like, did all of the success that I've had, like how I define success or how other people define success, in either case, you can say that I've been successful. Certainly GrubHub was, and some of the other things I've done has been as well. None of those things have led to contentment. And so, a couple things to note there is that, if you're a founder and you're like, I'm going to be miserable now so that I'm happy in the future, you're lying to yourself. The only way to be happy in the future is to be happy now. This idea of like, I'm living a deferred life so that later on I can be happy, it never plays out that way. Because you have to learn how to be content in your current situations. Now, this is the pot calling the kettle black, because like, I am not good at this. As soon as I accomplish something, I'm on to like, okay, what's next? And it's probably a pathology, to be honest. I happen to be able to funnel that towards innovation, towards excitement, creating a business. And there's a lot of positives. There's some negatives too, which is I'm very impatient, right? So at GrubHub and at Fixer and at the different things that I've been involved with, it's like, all right, what's next? What's next? What's next? How do we go faster? How do we do this better? And there's like never a break. There's never a celebration. There's never like, I'm never the one who's like, we just had an IPO. We should all have a beer. Like, I'm never the one to organize that. I'm on to the next thing. And so on the one hand, it drives amazing growth and innovation, but on the other hand, it can really burn people out. And so for me, it was helpful to have Matt to balance that attitude a little bit. It was helpful to surround myself with people who saw that blind spot and forced me to pause and celebrate. And so I think that that's part of the solution. Is it takes different personalities. It takes a diversity of thought for a company to be successful. You want people who drive. You want people who are discontent and angry, but you also want people who care about the humans, right? Who are like, okay, slow down, champ. Like, you're really going too hard here. Like, it was helpful to have those people at the company and in my life now. And it makes me both more content and the people at the company more content. And so I think a lot of founders have this sort of type A personality. Part of the solution, that's a good thing if you can balance it with other people who also sort of fill in the different complementary sort of aspects that are needed for a business.
So how do founders ask for help? Because I know a lot of them, and even through this interview series that we've been conducting, I've gotten founders saying it took me, 6 weeks into program to realize I can't do this on my own. I need to, stop being so stubborn and start asking for help. Can you speed up that process for them a little bit?
Yeah, it starts with an attitude. The president at Fixer, Josh, who was the head of product at GrubHub early on, one of the things he says is be a tourist. If you're in a new city, pull out the map and look at it. Don't worry about the fact that you look foolish when you pull out the map and you look at it in the middle of a city. Because what happens when you pull out that map is people stop and try and help you. And even though you look foolish being the tourist, you've signaled that you're open. You're open to new knowledge, to new experiences. And that attitude can be applied across almost everything in the startup world. If you don't know the answer to a question, don't be afraid. Like, if somebody says something, you're like, I don't understand what they just said, and then you're silent because you want to sort of be the leader, or you want to retain respect, or you want to look like the expert, you've missed an opportunity to learn. And if you do enough of those opportunities to learn, if you are the tourist, if you ask the stupid questions, if you do it again and again and again for a decade, it turns out at the end of that decade, you are the expert because you were learning the whole time. Mm-hmm. So, when that guy said, like, your investment, like, it doesn't balance, I was like, well, the next set of questions, like, well, how do I balance the balance sheet? I was like, well, this is now a learning opportunity, right? Yeah. And then I went home and I researched it, right? And when somebody says something in a board meeting and, like, I don't quite get it, I don't challenge them. I'm asking, I'm trying to learn. And 95% of the time I'm learning. 5% of the time you find out that person was just bluster and they don't know what they were talking about, which is its own whole, like, weird moment. Yeah. But I think this idea of being the tourist, always asking the questions, not worrying about how it looks, and just being committed to learning, that genuinely leads towards people helping you.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I could agree more with that. Fostering that mindset of curiosity. It's something that I've always tried to, like, pride myself on. It's just like asking questions. Everyone always says no question's a stupid question, but then you have these questions in your head and you're like, this is a really stupid question. I shouldn't ask this.
I can give you a really specific example of this that applies to software companies, because software companies are generally building new products, and you'll end up, everyone in a startup ends up in this moment where you're talking about what the customers want. And what you're really doing is you're taking what you think the customers want and you're applying it to the product. And there's no substitute to actually talking to customers and asking them what they want. Pretending you know what other people think in that product conversation is one of the places that insidiously creeps in with startups. And it's a place where you start with this idea of being curious, being a tourist, asking for help, talking to your customers. And I think that if you start there and you keep that orientation, you just learn a lot. You actually become an expert in a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I want to wind down the conversation with one last question. And this is Techstars specific because we didn't focus too much on it during the presentation. But can you, for the founders out there who are thinking about joining a program, they're not entirely sure about joining Techstars, tell them why you think they should join the program, what benefits they can get out of it, aside from, obviously getting your master class in hiring.
Um, I think you need every founder. So by founding a business, you put yourself in a position of authority, really ultimate authority in that domain. And you need people. You cannot surround yourself with yes people. You need people who tell you your shit smells. You need people who tell you you're wrong. And Techstars has a structure for doing that. And it does it in a way that's not overly harsh, right? So, and you end up with peers who tell you you're wrong at times too. And so if you're, no one, I made mistakes when I started GrubHub. And some of those mistakes are necessary because it's experimental and it's innovation. You can't get everything right in the first place. But some of those mistakes, because I was just boneheaded and didn't know things yet. So if you can avoid that second category of mistakes by having people around you who can teach you and who can inform you, it maximizes your chances of success.
Wonderful. I think that's a great way to put it. And I'm happy to share that with founders after we get this released on the internet. But
Awesome.
Thanks a ton, Mike. Again, like I said, I really, really appreciated the time. It was great chatting with you.
All right. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And if you're watching this, would love to, and you want to see more, check out my book. It's called Hangry.
Yes, definitely. Everyone check out Mike's book. We'll put a link in the description. Definitely give it a read. It's awesome. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more stories from the Techstars Network, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and check out our other social media. If you're a founder looking to 10x your startup, do not hesitate to visit our website to apply to a program today. And most importantly, always remember, give first.